The billionaire's daughter reveals a shocking truth. After 2 years, her real mom is a waitress. The word fell through the room like a dropped glass. Mama. Ava Lewis felt the sound land in her chest before she registered the rest of the world. A tiny hand, sticky with the remains of whipped cream, reached up and curled around the hem of her apron. The toddler's eyes were large and serious, the kind of gaze that always looks like it's trying to remember something that happened before language. Around them, spoons stopped mid-air. A chair scraped across marble. The candlelight on the long table, where a group of men in suits were counting silver, blinked and steadied as heads turned. "That child's—" the maître d' started, his voice collaring itself into propriety and accusation at once. He was a man who calculated trouble in decibels and cost. "You can't—" The child's mother, her hair immaculate, pearls very near, shot up from her seat and moved toward the scene with a practiced, frost-thin smile. Her hand went instinctively for the child's shoulder, then froze as the little girl slid, tiny and determined, toward Ava. Ava's knees buckled out from under her, like someone had yanked a support beam. Her apron was damp, with lemon-scented cleaner and coffee. She had been wiping a table. She had stepped into a life that had already been arranged for her to be unseen. Now the toddler's lips formed the single syllable again, as if it were a prayer and not an accusation. "Mama." The room shifted. The woman with the pearls was no mother. She was Isabel Hargrove by the telephoto lens of a magazine cover, poised, curated, and at that moment, very suddenly revealed as a fiction. Men in crisp suits glanced at one another. A fork clinked on porcelain like a gavel. "Get her out," the maître d' said to Ava, and there was no question as to which her he meant. Heat flooded Ava's ears. Humiliation is a thing that lands and stays. It paints the inside of a person with a dry, reacting paint. Her hands, which knew how to cradle warm plates, trembled as someone from the back office, Marco, the restaurant manager, who liked to assert power over the people on the floor, stepped forward with the practiced authority of small men who think the world is their ledger. "You're fired," he said. Not a question. Not even a pause. The toddler tightened her grip on the fabric of Ava's apron. "Mama," she said again, more insistently, as though she were trying to pull a truth out of a stone. Ava looked at the child. She saw the thin scar along the eyebrow, where someone's idea of a rough bedtime had left a pale line. She saw a matching freckle on the left cheek. She saw a mouth that moved like a small animal's, fast, earnest. For a moment, time, Ava's awful, elastic time, folded in two. 2 years slid over her like a film. Cramped rooms in Zurich, a signed stack of papers, the sterile smell of a clinic she was told to trust, the offered money that filled her rent, and then some, the deliberate placement of condolence flowers when they told her the baby had not survived. "Mama," the child said, and it was a name that did not belong in any ledger. Before Ava could respond, a shadow moved along the periphery. A man in a long coat, with the kind of face that had been buffed by travel and power, Julian Hargrove, was already there, as if he had heard the word and come running. He moved across the floor, with the economy of someone unaccustomed to uncertainty. He scooped the child into his arms as he crossed, the newspaper's face in human form, and his expression was softer than his public image allowed. For a second, the restaurant's marble became something else, an arena where histories collided. "That's my daughter," Julian said to the room, his voice low but carried. He did not look at Ava at first, not with the measured look publicized photographers were used to. He looked at the child like he was trying to remember the exact sound of her breath. "You can't just—" Marco sputtered, affronted. The woman with the pearls made a sound that balanced between anger and disbelief. Accusation had been cast. A new, louder reality had been dropped in its place. Julian turned to Ava then. Up close, his face was older than press photos suggested. Grief and impatience sat in the planes of his cheek. "Who are you?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that needed an answer anchored in flesh and not rumor. "Wait!" Ava opened her mouth and found it full of old, broken English. Her accent from a decade of night shifts and crude Spanish phrases melted into something sharper. "My name is Ava Lewis. She swallowed. "I was a surrogate in Zurich. 2 years ago. The clinic—" "Eris Thorne," Julian supplied. His voice had a librarian's precision. "Dr. Thorne at Gene Core Life." Color leached from Ava's face. The name itself was a small hammer. "Yes," she said. A silence spread. Somewhere near the bar, a waiter stopped drying a glass. Plate edges shivered. The child tucked her thumb into her mouth, eyes heavy with the kind of clarity only children have. She knew the place she belonged, and she would name it. Julian set the child down in his lap, as if to shield her from the outrage. He turned his coat collar up against the rain that had begun to stitch itself along the restaurant's windows. He looked at Ava with the kind of controlled decision that makes fortunes move. "Come with me," he said. "You're taking me," Ava began, disbelief laced with fear. She had learned to mistrust sudden kindness. It carried interest and liabilities. "I'm taking all of us somewhere safe," Julian replied. "If what you're saying is true, if you were with Dr. Thorne, and if she delivered a child 2 years ago, then we need to find out what happened, now." He did not speak to the manager. He did not argue public faces. He paid for the table with a card, and his hand was steady. His presence turned the accusation into a public mystery, a sentence that would travel. People at the next table pretended not to listen but had already reached for their phones. The child said, "Mama," again, as if to punctuate the moment. They left in a drizzle. Rain on the car glass sliced the street into streaks of light. The city smelled of wet pavement and lemon oil. Ava sat in the back, the child's small hand still curled in her fingers, and let the world compress to the immediate. The beat of the child's pulse against her palm, Julian's breath doing the math of something that could not be solved with money alone, and the apron in the armrest. Faint coffee stain. "You told me I lost my baby," Ava said finally, and the words wrenched from a place she had made into a careful mute. "They gave me a certificate that said the baby was stillborn. They put a ribbon on my leaving." Julian's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. For a moment he was not the man the tabloids had told cities about. He was someone close to grief. "My wife, Isabel," he said, and the name came out like a stone. "She told me she—" He stopped and exhaled. Isabel's story was that she had given birth. They said, everyone said, Isabel didn't survive. They said our daughter lived. I was told different things. I was told to trust the documentation. The admission was a fragile thing. It did not erase the last 2 years. It did not account for the nights Ava had sobbed into her pillow when the memory of a hospital room turned to phantom. But it opened a seam. 2 narratives that had run parallel. Ava's quiet, buying a way through life ledger and Julian's public ledger of grief suddenly overlapped at Dr. Eris Thorne's name. By the time the car turned into Hargrove Estate, Ava felt suspicious in a new way, as though the world had tilted a degree and shown hidden seams. Julian led them into a drawing room with glass that looked out on the rain. The child. Sophia Grace Hargrove, Julian said later when a name had to be spoken, sat on the rug and poked at a toy like all of this was a game. Margaret Doyle arrived an hour later. The woman had a look like she had spent her life negotiating doors. She had no smile, only a pragmatism that approached kindness. She listened while Ava said the words, slowly, as if the pieces could be carved into different forms. Zurich, Ava repeated. Gene Core Life. Thorne. I signed papers. They gave me a packet. Said the baby didn't make it. Margaret took notes with a pen that had belonged to someone else's long history of collecting facts. Did you have contact numbers? Emails? A copy of your contract? Ava produced a folder from the bag on her shoulder. It contained the brittle proof of a life she had been eager to forget, the contract with an agency name she'd barely read, a stamped receipt for a hotel near the clinic, a sheepish photograph of a newborn hand in a white glove that had been handed to her in a moment of cold management. Her hands hovered over the items like a woman touching a sleeping animal. "There's no birth certificate in my name," Ava said. "They told me the records. They said the child was stillborn. They signed the form. They paid the fee. I left." Margaret's eyebrows met for a moment. "We need DNA," she said. "We need to confirm the simplest thing first. Whether this—" She gestured at the child with a respect that made the syllable small. "Is biologically yours?" Julian nodded. He had the means to pay for every test in the world. He also had the kind of authority that could bring labs and subpoenas and men who could find records with a phone call. But something in his face showed he knew that the loop between papers and truth could be long and full of sand. "We'll do a private test," Julian said. "Fast, but legally documented." They moved with a procedural caution that Ava did not expect. The child, Sophia, sat with Ava and called her name in a voice that hooked a chilled part of Ava's gut with repeated tenderness. "Mama," she said again, and the syllable struck like a bell. If this were a different story, it might have been mercifully simple. DNA samples were swabbed in a small licensed clinic the next morning. Julian insisted on a discreet facility with an old nurse who smelled of violets and had a hand that trembled a little with age. Ava watched the lab tech collect the cheek swab with the same awkwardness she would watch a blood draw, as if every transfer of tissue might be an insult or a blessing, depending on whoever read it. "These results might take up to a week," the nurse told them, in a voice that had never promised miracles. "Faster if priority is requested." Julian signed the forms with the same steady hand that signed donations and construction contracts. He asked for priority. The first days after the swab felt like a holding pattern Ava had known too well. She lived in moments of small economizing of hope, a cup of coffee that tasted like something to be earned, a night where the city bowed under its own streetlight. She was not naive. She had learned to guard hope like currency, but the child's small hand, so often a rope thrown into a hungry sea, kept her from being wholly closed off. Margaret worked in the margins. She pulled an investigator named Cooper, a man who had faded out of intelligence work and now collected quiet favors for the right fees. He had friends in customs and a fondness for late-night van rides. He began combing records. At first, the trail stuttered in polite ways. GeneCore Life had a glossy website that glowed with patient testimonials and a board of directors whose photographs could have been consultancy stock. But under that sheen, Cooper found things that irritated him like burrs. There were shell companies, payment lines that led to unusual accounts, a forwarding address in Zurich that resolved into a room number in a medical building off a street used for expatriates. Then, 8 days in, Ava's phone buzzed with a message from a number she did not know. "There are files," it said. "Meet in Zurich. Midnight. The courier will be a woman named Clara." Something in the name pressed into Ava's memory like a poorly mended seam. "Clara," she said aloud to Margaret as if speaking could conjure an omen. "Be careful," Margaret replied. "People who contact us from the inside don't do it for nothing. They bring risk, both to themselves and to those they help. Risk is everything for them," Cooper said when Margaret relayed the message. "They trade their safety for truth. If someone named Clara is willing to walk into an alley to hand us a drive, we need to know why." Julian's face tightened. He had not imagined a woman mid-raid handing over a litany of secret files. He imagined courtrooms, affidavits, and public apologies. He had money for all those things, but secrecy had its own currency, lives traded, fear paid in small, steady installments. Ava booked a flight on instinct before she had fully thought it through. Old places have a way of reactivating old ghosts. Zurich smelled of antiseptic and rain. The clinic's facade shimmered in the night like a promise with a seam. The alleys around it remembered footsteps. The woman they met in the warehouse district called herself Clara Voss. She did not look like a heroine. She carried a nurse's badge in a wallet, the letters slightly smudged from constant cleaning. Her hands shook enough that the plastic card rattled when she took it from her purse. She spoke with the clipped, careful cadence of someone who had rehearsed her courage and had to stop to catch her breath between sentences. "They used to bring babies through at all hours," Clara said, eyes darting like a deer. "Different names, different parents on paper, people with no name, contracts signed by men who never showed their faces, money wired through accounts nobody ever asked about." Clara slid a small thumb drive across the metal table, like a relic in an offering. "This has camera footage," she said, "clinic corridors, deliveries, a file labeled Isabel Hargrove, Oct E8. There are ledger snapshots too, payments, names, obfuscated, but enough to follow." Ava's heart contracted as if someone had put a clamp on it. Oct 8, a date she had tried to unremember. Her eyes landed on the corner of the drive, where a tiny scratch looked like a scar. "There's more," Clara said. "Paper ledgers, a piece of a conversation recorded, Isabel's voice speaking to Dr. Thorne. Draw up the certificate," she heard Isabel say. "Make sure our friends are satisfied." Isabel. The syllable was a blade. Ava pressed her palms flat on the table, feeling the wood's grain like a map. "Why?" she began, but Clara's mouth closed on her next words. "They're careful. They use fixers, Melanie, banks in the Caymans, shells, people who file things, people who bury things," Clara said. "If you want this to be real, you go public with some of it. But be careful who you trust." "We have lawyers," Julian said. He looked at Clara with a clarity that could have been either gratitude or suspicion. "We will protect you. We will verify the files." Clara's laugh was hollow. "Protection is a word for the rich," she said. "You have money, but do you have the kind of power willing to indict the people who walk in the rooms with Isabel? They'll come at you in ways you won't expect." The drive was tiny and heavy with meaning. Margaret slid it into her bag like someone putting a live bird into a travel box. Cooper photographed the nurse's badge and sent the images to a secure drop. Julian offered to arrange asylum for Clara if she would come to the States. She shook her head. "If they know I'm gone, they'll close the doors," she said, "and they'll make an example." On the return flight, Ava turned the word mama over in her mouth until it felt raw. She remembered the way the nurse at the clinic had laid a blanket over her arms and said the words that had become a ritual. "We are sorry." She had accepted the condolence because grief is a thing you learn to wear like a coat, heavy, unavoidable, and awkward. Now the coat felt like it had been taken from a different person. The drive and Clara's badge were the first real hinge of the investigation. Cooper traced signatures to a name that made him frown. Richard Melanie. He pulled financial lines that smeared like ink on a napkin. Transfers registered as consulting fees, leading to a web of accounts. Julian's people managed subpoenas that began to stake out the perimeters of those accounts. Margaret filed requests that would, in time, find their way into courtrooms. But law moves with the steady pace of an organism that distrusts suddenness. They were not fast enough, Ava thought, to outrun what came next. A photo arrived in the sheriff's department inbox one night. A grainy shot, taken from above, of the Hargrove estate's back lawn. The child's play area was visible like a tiny island. A stamped corner of the image had a number, 1:42 a.m. Someone had been hovering. Ava found the picture on Julian's desk. She thought it would make her angry. Instead, it made her steady in a way she had not been. Her hands found the small girl's wrist and drew close. "You're not going to let go," she told the child, because that sentence had to be spoken. The child looked up with the world's simple confidence and said, "Mama," in a voice that carried, once again, everything and nothing. They increased security. Julian's lawyers drafted cautions. Margaret put Cooper on the streets to find the photographer. They began to thread the pieces. The certificate with a blank signature on a government form that did not match any authorized stamp, a payment trace to Melanie's account, an offhand mention of Facility 9 in a ledger Clark had shown them. Each element placed another brick in a wall they could not yet see over. The ledger arrived in a leather envelope a week later, found in a storage unit that Cooper broke into under the color of darkness and the permission one buys from men who remember favors. The leather smelled like old libraries and rain. Inside, a small book had been bound like an accountant's diary, entries of names and dates and amounts. One line read, ZR019, Ava Lewis, $200,000, arrangement complete. Ava touched the writing, as if to see whether the words were alive. They were. The ledger was a small explosive, a thing that rearranged the room. Julian held it with a look that implied apology and iron. "We can take this to the district," he said. "But they'll want verification, witnesses. They'll come for the men above the book, not the one who wrote it." "Who wrote it?" Ava asked. "Melanie," Margaret said. "He does the paying. He moves the money. He's the cleaner." "He's the man who signs the checks and smiles," Julian added. "He makes sure the right people don't ask the wrong questions." Margaret thumbed the ledger. "This is big," she said. "This isn't just one forged document. It's a system." They did not have everything. They rarely did. That was the way real work, investigation went, with hands reaching for slivers of truth and pulling out something that glowed, a name here, a number there. It was not neat, it was expensive. It took patience, and then the other kind of violence, the threats. At first, they were minor things meant to be unsettling. An unmarked envelope at Julian's office contained a photograph. Ava, at work, taken from across the street. Someone had stood in the rain and captured a woman who never expected to be watched. A drone hovered a few feet above Sophia's play area one night until the security team chased it into darkness. An anonymous email arrived with the subject line, "Leave it alone." Inside a single sentence, "Not every truth wants the light." It was as if a throat had cleared somewhere deep in the world and whispered to them that turning over one stone might knock another free. Clara had warned them. People who move against institutions carry a price. That price often arrived before the checks and court dates. Ava tried to sleep. She would lie awake and count the ways her life had been bought and traded. Surrogacy had been a transaction. She had been told which days to count and which medications to take. She had been told families to imagine and then discouraged from thinking of them as real. She had been compensated and consoled, the transfer of a child into hands that did not belong. These were not things that fit into the boxes she had been given. "You're not alone," Julian told her one night when the rain had that wet, insisting quality, and the house hummed like a contained thing. He had the look of a man who had traded years of privacy for a battle. "This is bigger than me, bigger than you, but I'm not stepping away." Ava's reply was a whisper. "I'm scared." He reached for her hand. "So am I." The first part of the fight was not yet public. They staged the pieces, legal hold requests, retention of evidence, a quiet meeting with a judge who had the kind of reputation Margaret liked. Measured, not showy. They filed motions. They made sure samples were preserved. They arranged for an accredited lab to process the DNA as a confirmatory sample, one that would be admissible later if they had to bring it to court. The swab result came back sooner than they expected, an overnight priority that bore the stamp of Julian's resources and Margaret's strategizing. The lab called with a procedural voice, then offered a small, human beat. "We have preliminary confirmation," the technician said. "It's a biological match." The word matched landed like a hand on a table. For a long, slow moment, Ava could not breathe. A life she had accepted as a closed door, opened and flooded the room with light. When she began to cry, the sound was not just grief, but release. All the suppressed syllables she had never allowed herself to voice. The child's mama was suddenly tethered to something that could be argued, proved, verified. They did not shout it from the rooftops. They handled it like lit materials, cautiously, precisely. Margaret arranged for a formal chain of custody, an independent lab to do the second test, an affidavit to be ready should they need to present the sample in court. Julian made calls that threaded through his lawyers and came back with names of people who could shield evidence and expose men. But shards of the past did not remain gently placed. The ledger's lines suggested a network. The flash drive Clara had given them held a clip, grainy, then clearer, and a child's voice at the very end of the footage. "Mama," whispered into a camera, as if naming someone who had been hidden from view. Ava watched the clip in a room with the blinds drawn. The child's voice echoed, tiny and stunning. On screen, the newborn's hand clutched at fabric. Isabel's voice could be heard, faint and commanding. "Make sure the certificate is clean. Make sure our investors are satisfied." The camera panned to Dr. Eris Thorne, hands steady over instruments, calm as a man who had reconciled the trade of flesh for favors into a science. Watching the image, Ava felt something like a long-remembered ache swell into a fist. The video was not maliciously edited. It was a document, a recorded breath which could not be unbreathed. It put names beside movements. It tied Isabel's voice to Dr. Thorne's hands to a ledger entry that had her name on it as arrangement complete. Margaret looked at the screen and said flatly, "This is enough to get warrants. This is enough to make a prosecutor sit up. And to make them violent," Cooper said. "If Melanie and his people see the ledger and the drive leak, they won't just file motions. They'll move. We have to be prepared for dirty tricks. They'll try to buy silence or intimidate." Ava's fear took on a new texture. It was not only the humiliation that had defined her before, it became a responsibility. The child's syllable, "Mama," was no longer a private echo. It was an accusation that demanded things of the world: truth, reckoning, restitution. That night, the estate's security system pinged with a minor alert, a cut on a perimeter camera. Nothing else. The file showed a shadow sliding along the wall, a man's silhouette with a hood. They tightened patrols. Cooper tracked a vehicle with a license plate traced to a shell company in Florida that had a history of buying silence for high-net-worth individuals. Melanie's name came up again in the ledger line, not just a fixer, but a man who removed problems. "Melanie doesn't like people who expose his books," Margaret said, "and he's protected by lawyers who are good at delaying things." Ava felt rage like a warmth beneath the skin, a steady heat that made her hands stop shaking. She was not a woman with a fortune or a publicist. She was a woman who had been told her child did not live, and had been offered a neat, polite grief. Now that neatness unspooled into a messy human truth. She wanted justice not for the headline, but for the child whose name she had never thought she could speak aloud without being dismissed. They planned their next steps. Margaret organized a list of objectives. Verify the ledger, ensure Clara's safety, secure the drive's chain of custody, file the appropriate motions. Julian began to prepare for what would come: media, lawsuits, threats that would not be only to him, but to anyone he claimed as family. Ava taught herself to sit in rooms of men whose power could make things happen, and to listen for the slippage between what they said and what they meant. She learned to ask questions with a voice that would not sound like a plea. She found in herself a new steadiness, a kind of rationed courage that was not performative but practical. 2 days later, Clara called with an address in Zurich, an abandoned salon south of the river. "Come alone," she said. "Bring nothing that could identify you." Ava nearly refused. Margaret argued and compromised. They insisted she take a single person with her, Cooper, who agreed to be the shadow behind the shadow, the man who would not draw attention. Julian offered to send men, but Clara had refused the idea of a convoy. They notice convoys, she said. They watch convoys. They don't watch a woman and a courier in a different language. Ava went anyway. She took the hiss of rain as a kind of benediction and held Sophia's small hand in her pocket like an ember. The salon was full of old mirrors and dusty chairs. Clara arrived in a coat soaked at the hem. She handed Ava a packet of photocopied pages and a photograph rolled like a prayer. "Take these," Clara whispered. "This is what you need to start. There's a storage facility in Geneva with files, a ledger, but it's guarded. They will come after you. They will come after the ledger. Melanie does not like loose ends." After they parted, Ava stood in the rain and let it sift over her like a confession. There was so much to do that had nothing to do with any one person. Law firms to notify, a caring plan for a child who had already been shuttled between hands, places to make safe for the women who had been used. The ledger in the salon's packet had a number folded twice, Facility 9. She remembered the child's voice on the drive, soft and intimate. "Mama." It had been uttered twice at lunch, again at the lab, again on Clara's footage. It had the taste of someone reaching across a desert for a single person who would answer. When Ava returned to the estate, the downstairs door was ajar. A sticky note, white, anonymous, sat on the kitchen counter. The handwriting was spidery and unsteady. "We are watching." It was a message from a shadow who had not yet shown his face. Ava folded the note into the small of her palm until the lines burned like a brand. She placed it in a drawer and did not tell Julian immediately. She didn't want him to see the fear that had become some kind of currency between them. Instead, she sat on the stairs and listened to the house breathe. Sophia's soft sleep sounds drifted through upstairs rooms like a promise. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, Ava put her hand to her heart and felt the child's rhythm match hers. "Mama." The word was no longer an accusation. It was a summons. They had the ledger. They had the drive. They had a voice caught on a grainy video and a date, Oct 8, that seemed to tremble like a hinge. They had a name attached to a scientist and a fixer who had the capacity to erase people like chalk writing on a wall. And they had a child who called Ava, a word that had been hidden from her life for 2 years. They also had men who, if pushed, would do dangerous things to keep their system intact. The case was beginning, not ending. The sound of "Mama" would resound in rooms they had yet to enter, courtrooms, storage units, clinics with stairwells that smelled of disinfectant and fear. People would be asked to tell the truth in the light. Papers would be subpoenaed. Men would try to extinguish the light. Ava stood by the window and watched a small tree shaking bristles of rain. She thought of the kitchen apron she'd been forced to fold into a drawer at the restaurant, of the way Marco had said, "You're fired," as if he was signing a verdict. She thought of Isabel's voice on a recording, the calm instruction to draw up the certificate. She thought of Clara's shaking hands and the ledger's black ink. She thought of the child in the next room, breathing sleep into the house with the steady trust of someone who had no idea how much she had already changed the world. When she finally went upstairs, Sophia opened one eye and mumbled, "Mama," then pulled the blanket up to her chin. Ava smiled, a small defiant thing, like a flame protected in a jar, and sat beside the child's bed. She took the small hand into both of hers and said softly enough for only the two of them, "I'm here." Outside, a car idled far away at the end of the drive. It was a sound barely audible beneath the rain, but to Ava it sounded like the future, which was never quiet and rarely kind. She listened to the hush and let the child's "mama" settle into her bones. They had started the right way, with a single syllable and a stubborn human insistence. The world beyond their windows would not bend easily to them. Men like Melanie would try to bargain. Institutions would duck and weave. But a voice had spoken the truth. A child had named a mother, and the naming would not be undone by suits or ledger lines. Ava rested her forehead against the child's small knuckles and felt the tremble of a heart that had known only a small set of hands, and now had two. "Stay," she whispered to the house, to the ledger, to the city. "Stay long enough for us to finish." The road ahead was long. They had the beginning of proof, a woman named Clara who had risked everything, and the knowledge that the system that had taken children for money ran deeper than anyone had guessed. But the first fires of exposure were lit. Men were assembling their counters. Names were moving through chains of command. Somewhere a man in a hood watched the estate's lights through rain and made a call. In Zurich, a storage unit's lock clicked open for the first time in years. In Jeancore Life's offices, a file marked "Confidential Isabel Hargrove" was pulled from a folder and set on a desk. And in the quiet of a child's bedroom, a woman named Ava listened to the steady rise and fall of a small breath and held tight to the truth that had finally found its voice. They opened the storage unit under a rain-soaked sky, the way one opens a buried letter, slowly, with gloves, and a sense that whatever was inside might burn to the touch. Cooper picked the lock like someone who had forgotten what legitimate doors felt like. The metal door rolled up with a shudder. The smell of old paper and dust hit them first. Inside, under tarps, they found boxes stamped with dates, hospital seals, and folded between surgical pads, a thin manila folder with a sticker, "Confidential, Facility 9. Julian set the folder on a table and, for a moment, the room seemed smaller. He had the look people get when they touch a fact that matches a fear they've been keeping at arm's length. Margaret's pen hovered like an instrument of mercy. Ava steadied herself against a stack of shipping crates. Sophia sat in the back of the van, quiet, turning a bracelet until the beads clicked. Inside the folder were manifests, a shipping log that traced children to a cluster of clinics and then to an address in Montana, marked only as Echo Ridge. There were names, but many had been replaced with codes. There were ultrasound images, dated and annotated. An entry read, OCT8, HGRV, delivery complete, transfer to Section B, paperwork forwarded. Ava read the line and felt the room tilt. October 8th had been the date that had dropped like a stone into the center of her life. The ledger, the drive, Isabel's voice, all of it converged on a place with a cold, bureaucratic name that meant nothing to those who did not know what those words could hide. Echo Ridge. They did not run to headlines. They had learned to use patience as armor. Margaret organized a call with Special Agent Deanna Hart. Deanna's voice was low and official. She asked for what she needed in a cadence that left no room for theatrical gestures. "We need warrants," she said. "We need chains of custody, verified lab results, and corroboration on that Facility 9 reference. If your goal is to get justice and not a leaked circus, we do it by the book, and we move fast." "The ledger pointed to accounts," Margaret said. "We have payment traces to Melanie. We can show transfers. We have a flash drive with footage. We have a nurse, Clara, who provided it." Deanna's tone held a measure of weariness at the name. "Clara will be protected if she can get here." She paused. "This group is sophisticated. If they suspect we're coming, they disappear people. We need to be precise, or we will only be shoving at a shadow." The day they presented the materials to a federal magistrate, Melanie's attorneys were already taking action. Subpoenas and motions trickled into the courthouses of 3 states. Legal teams from offshore firms filed protective orders for accounts. A silence the size of a county hovered around the ledger like a fog. No one moved without a lawyer watching the move like a card game. Months passed, and the legal calendar became a drumbeat. Margaret treated the rhythms like a map: depositions, motions to unseal, subpoenas for server logs, a demand for the Dr. Thorne's clinic logs from Gene Corps Life's European offices. The prosecutors moved cautiously. They would be the ones to build a case that could survive tribunals and the expensive lawyers Melanie hired to erode juries and drain purses. All the while, someone watched them. It was a night call that changed everything. A voice, hoarse with fear, said only 2 words: "Clara's dead." The line went thin, as if the world itself had been drawn through a needle. Clara Voss had been found in an alley near the clinic where she once worked. The press would later call it a robbery gone wrong. People who make their life trading secrets sometimes find themselves swallowed by less charitable narratives. Ava, who had held Clara's small, trembling hands in a Zurich warehouse, understood the finality of the tone on that line. Clara's laugh had been full of carved humor. Clara's hands had been clean of falsehood. When Clara died, a witness had gone silent. Julian's face, which had been adult and controlled for months, finally lost its private armor. He walked around the estate like a man trying to find his shoes in a dark house. Ava stood at the kitchen counter and held Sophia like a small, warm claim against the news. The child murmured "Mama" in sleep, and the syllable felt like an oath. Margaret and Cooper flew to Zurich. The hospital's security footage had been corrupted, the clinic's servers lit with 1,000,000 tiny errors. Diana issued a mutual request letter for cooperation. Attorneys filed motions to compel. Melanie's lawyers argued jurisdiction. It would be weeks before any legal engine could force hands. But investigations do not only live in courtrooms, they live in little human acts. A janitor with a bruised conscience sent an email with a grainy photo from the clinic's back corridor. A courier gave Margaret a small envelope with 4 slips of paper that, when pieced together, revealed a safe deposit key. They began to pull at threads. Ava's anger, which had been a close thing, a warmth under the skin, became something near. The day they opened a safety deposit box in Geneva and found a flash of personal, incriminating detail, a videotape with Isabel's voice and a ledger entry with Melanie's hand scrawled beside an account number. The world tilted again. That tape had been prepared as an insurance policy, a recorded meeting where Isabel had discussed ensuring the trust lines were satisfied, and where Dr. Thorne had murmured about proper documentation. It was a bureaucracy turned cold. Margaret made the first strategic call to a reporter she trusted, not to dump everything, but to make a point. They released a cropped, legally vetted excerpt of Clara's footage and a sanitized summary of the ledger to a single investigative reporter at a respected outlet. The purpose was tactical: to get the story on a public docket so that prosecutors who had been moving slowly could justify broader action, and so that political cover would be harder for the implicated parties to find. The leak did what leaks do best and worst. It turned a private fight into a public question. Social feeds filled with outraged comments. Activists knocked on the doors of congressional aides. Julian's name, once a target of gossip, became an ally for those demanding answers. The Hargrove family, complex and storied, made the fight more visible than it might otherwise have been. Melanie did not retreat. His people escalated. An attempt on the life of a small-time judge who had previously done pro bono reviews for the kind of trusts that benefited Melanie's network sent new ripples of terror through the system. The judge survived, but the message was clear. The players in this game would upset more than reputations if necessary. Ava felt it in new ways. She had been humiliated in a restaurant. She had been offered a neat place in grief. Now the stakes were lawless, and danger was wearing the business suit of those who thought they could buy distance from consequences. She began to sleep in shifts, in rooms with locks she had never had before. Sophia learned that Mommy sometimes left in a black car and came back later. The child's world incorporated the strange rituals adults performed. The decision to go public with more of the evidence belonged to the prosecutors, not to Julian's PR team or Margaret's hunger for theatrics. Deanna Hart framed it simply: "We can act if we can show probable cause. We need an operational plan for the raid. We need to rescue anyone there and collect the records without tipping off the people who run it." The warrant for Echo Ridge was not a late-night raid that played like a movie. It was an accumulation of months: forensic accountants drawing lines, server logs being subpoenaed, whispers of property ownership peeled back to find the trust behind the trust. When the warrant finally arrived, the people who executed it carried law with them. Armored, careful, precise. Echo Ridge was not a place on any promotional brochure. It was a utilitarian complex tucked under pine and scrub, accessed by a road that felt to the first-time visitor like a throat narrowing into a mouth. The facility looked ordinary until one saw the rooms it kept: small beds, crates of baby clothing, folders labeled with case numbers instead of names. The presence of living children startled the officers. They had been prepared for documents and for contraband, not for this human shock. They found the archives, low-ceilinged rooms, with metal shelving and boxes labeled with dates and codes. There were vials with innocuous labels, syringes in locked cabinets, ultrasound prints neatly stacked in manila envelopes. There were also small beds where infants slept, some swaddled and clean, some with tags that bore names that were not their own. The agents moved with the practiced steadiness of people who had been trained to treat living humans with care under chaotic conditions. They did not find many adult witnesses. Some employees had been warned to leave. A nurse, young, exhausted, with a bruise at the edge of her eye, told Deanna through lips that trembled how children were prepared for placement, how documents were arranged, and how occasionally parents were never told the truth. She offered what she knew and asked for protection. Nothing in the room was hidden from Ava's eyes. It was one thing to trace a ledger entry on a table. It was another to stand in a room where children slept with names that had been erased from the papers that connected them to their parents. She walked among those beds like someone mourning a place that had never been theirs to name. There were also places that suggested darker logistics: a cold storage room with neatly labeled boxes of records and a sealed cooler with a fingerprinted tag. The sight of that cooler made every adult in the room quiet. Deanna's face hardening meant she had found evidence beyond missing papers. There were things in that cooler that would cause juries to sit up. They gathered what they could. They brought children into the light and into protective custody. They documented everything. The files were copied, the vials catalogued, the servers imaged. The raid did not close a wound. It opened a wound and then revealed the infection underneath. Melanie's people reacted violently in expected ways. Lawyers filed motions, politicians called for calm, and the staffs of implicated families scrambled to push the narrative of rogue operators. But the ledger and the tape and the children's presence spoke in a language that money could not merely overlay. Public outrage grew. There were protests in front of the Hargrove legal offices and vigils outside the embassies of the countries where the shell companies had been registered. Amid the headlines, a new piece of the puzzle fell into Ava's hands in a way that felt like something written in an old, shivering hand. Eleanor, Julian's house manager, the woman who had moved through the estate like a quiet shadow, left an envelope in Ava's room. It was not the sort of thing Eleanor usually did. She had been a constant, low-profile presence for years. People trusted house managers because they were invisible and steady. This envelope had a photograph folded inside and a slip of paper on which someone had written, "Some truths were never meant to be found." Inside was a photo of Isabel and Eleanor in conversation at a hospital conference. In the corner of the photo, someone had scrawled a time and a room number. Attached to the photograph was a short, trembling note from Eleanor that said, "I am sorry. I can tell you where Dr. Thorne kept his private ledger. He trusted me to manage the home. I was asked to provide names. I could not speak then. Eleanor had been both an insider and a conflicted voice. Ava did not have to decide whether Eleanor was guilty or coerced in an instant. She only had to accept that people like Eleanor sat in rooms where choices were made and sometimes found courage to open a door. Eleanor's slip of paper pointed to a safe in a house that had once been used as a secondary office, a place where Dr. Thorne had met with patrons. There were patient records there, with notes that matched the ledger lines. When Margaret brought a subpoena and opened the safe, the air around the room felt like a held breath. Inside were lists of names and transfer orders, and threaded between expense reports, a hand-labeled folder, Investor Placements, Priority. The handwriting was neat and instilled a cold, ordinary horror. Isabel's name appeared repeatedly, inked beside the phrase, Assure HGRV Satisfaction. There were numbers that traced payments to accounts in islands and to shell entities in the names of charitable organizations. Julian's reaction to the safe's contents was private and complicated. He sat with his head in his hands for a long time before he spoke. "She was my wife," he said finally, which was not an explanation but a confession. The courtroom where the hearing to recognize Ava's parentage would take place was packed in the way that historic moments gather people who believe the law can do something moral. Ava had never imagined herself being the center of such a spectacle. She had been taught to be invisible by the people who paid her. Now she sat under bright lights, with Julian beside her, Margaret at her elbow, Cooper watching from the gallery, and Deanna ready to offer testimony on the raids and the chain of custody. The defense was organized and formidable. Melanie's team argued for every delay they could find. They contested experts and demanded additional tests. They filed motions to exclude evidence on technicalities and used every tool the system affords to those with money. The judge, one whose tattoos of patience were visible under a judicial robe of fairness, listened and allowed certain evidence in and rejected other attempts to muddy the facts. The court moved with the weighted, granular pace of a machine set to do more than respond to outrage. Ava's voice, the day she testified, was small at first. The courtroom was the kind of room that demanded a person be a particular kind of brave, clear, credible, and unmoved by the theatrics of wealth. She told the story as simply as she could. The Zurich clinic, the contract, the stillborn note they had given her, the coffin of condolence, the empty arms. She spoke of the way grief had been laid upon her like a coat she had never been meant to wear. She told them about Clara and the flash drive and the ledger line that bore her name. When she said "Mama" in court, not in the voice of a child, but in the voice of the one who had been named, it landed like a bone thrown across the room. Sophia sat on Julian's lap, thumb in her mouth, looking at Ava with the pure, unfiltered clarity that makes the rest of the world seem like an elaborate distraction. The judge watched the child's face and the sworn woman who claimed her. Margaret called experts to explain the DNA chain of custody and the lab protocols. Deanna outlined the raid at Echo Ridge and described the rescued children and the files found. Prosecutors showed still frames from footage and ledger excerpts. Melanie's attorneys attacked provenance. They attacked chain of evidence, as defense counsel are trained to do. But the ledger lines, the flash drive, and the Isabel recording, the three pillars of evidence, formed an architectural truth that could not be easily shaken into nothing. The judge issued a ruling that was meticulous and measured. He vacated the forged birth certificate, ordered the state to recognize the biological parental link as proven, and granted custody protections for Ava and Sophia while the broader criminal case moved forward. The judge's language spoke of credibility, of standard of proof, of the need for the law to protect the vulnerable. For Ava, the words were simpler. On paper, her name was restored. On the page, she had been erased from, ink returned. The courtroom erupted in quiet ways. Sobs, the soft clicking of a recorder closing, the rustle of papers. For Ava, it was both a triumph and a beginning. The judge's order meant legal protection, a name written in a way the system could not barge past. But it did not mean the ledger was torn down, nor that all the men with money would be arraigned by morning. Justice had been served, but not yet completed. After the decision, a different storm arrived. Melanie's network tightened. Men threatened Julian in ways that required armored cars and anonymous security teams. A journalist who had been pushing a line of coverage received death threats. A former local official who had been a marginally named patron in the ledger stepped down from a committee after denials failed to stop the story. The pressure made the fight feel like a strain under which new cracks might show. Logan Tarrant's name had surfaced in the ledger as an architectural consultant, someone who arranged placements and managed logistics. He had been a ghost in the periphery, a man whose signature did not appear on the checks, but whose blueprints were everywhere. Finding him was like finding the person who drew the lines on a map, essential to dismantling the territory he had made. Cooper found Tarrant in an industrial suburb, housed in a building that smelled of old engines and new lawyers. He was not a man who looked like a myth. He had freckled knuckles and an athlete's posture, and the casual indifference of someone who had spent entire careers engineering systems that hid things. He let Cooper and Margaret into his office because he liked to talk to people who thought themselves clever. "We did a thing," Tarrant said, casual as a man announcing he had rearranged furniture. "We matched supply and demand. We made sure certain families got what they wanted. It wasn't personal. It was service." "What do you call the children?" Margaret asked. "Clients," Tarrant said, as if the words solved an equation. They had him in custody because of a combination of bad choices and overconfidence. Tarrant thought he could make deals. He thought he could negotiate from within the labyrinth. He had not counted on being live in the way the world had become. When the prosecution presented a plan that included a recorded statement, a legal deposition under pressure with counsel present, Tarrant agreed, confident he could pass words. But they did not plan to have his statement immediately go to public platforms. Ava, who had learned the power of turning a voice into a public instrument, insisted on pushing the confession into light during a coordinated press conference. It was a tactical decision fraught with risk. Confessions captured outside of explicit legal protections could be contested, and forcing a man to confess live could complicate prosecutions. Margaret and Deanna framed the action carefully. It would be a recorded deposition, legally obtained, but released with the consent of the U.S. Attorney's Office, who had an interest in the public safety imperative. Logan Tarrant adapted to the microphone like an actor to a stage. At first, his voice was smooth. He catalogued procurement channels like a man reading a shopping list. Then, an interviewer asked a question he hadn't been prepared for. What role did Isabel Hargrove play? Tarrant smiled like he had seen the question before and began to talk. He talked about rooms and how certain names were given code designations. He talked about shipments and about how paper erased memory. Then, in a slip that felt like something a trapdoor might cause, he said Isabel had been insistent and had directly authorized certain placements, and that Dr. Thorne had ensured documentation was clean. The words tumbled out, a catalogue of arrangements, names of facilitators, locations of storage. He named Melanie as the man with accounts. He named a politician who had been implicated in the ledger. He named a list of investors who wanted legacy that could be worn like a halo. The live feed took the admission, and the world shifted. People watched Tarrant's face as his words landed. He had not meant to say everything. He had miscalculated. The prosecution had the record, and the public had the truth poured into it through an unblinking lens. The ripple was immediate. Arrests followed, padded by warrants and a cascade of cooperation agreements from men who realized their chairs were heating. There were consequences. Some were legal, sharp and inevitable. Indictments, sealed charging documents, a dozen men taken into custody by federal marshals. Others were softer, corrosive, reputations ruined, foundations shuttered, board members resigning. Money did what money always does. It tried to surround itself with clean paper, but some stains cannot be washed. In the chaos, however, a human cost had been exacted. Clara's murder remained raw. Eleanor, who had given Ava the key to a safe, had been arrested on suspicion of complicity in certain falsifications. Her confession was not simple. She spoke of coercion and threats, of debts and fear. She said she had been paid small sums and been given subtle promises if she did as she was told. She was not absolved by words, neither was she a cartoon villain. The prosecution treated her with caution, offering cooperation for information if she would help them bring down larger players. The Hargrove name, which had once been used to pacify, turned into a platform for something else. Julian had to watch as men who were once part of his life, associates, partners, were implicated in ways that cost them power. He was not happy about the unraveling of decades of alliances, but he had committed himself to the fight and could not pretend to step away. Ava refused to be the face of a movement for long. The press wanted her photograph and a headline. She had been given fame that neither asked permission nor offered solace. She had to learn to say no, to refuse the cameras when they wanted spectacle over substance. She went instead to rooms where women sat with empty arms and stories that sounded like hers. Paid surrogates who had been told of stillbirths, families who had bought children through networks, women who had never known whether the lull and the bruise meant they had been used. The word mother meant different things to all of them, yet when a child looked at any of these women and made a noise, a mama, a look, a reach, a rightness arrived that infiltrated the noise. She and Julian formed an idea that would be not about celebrity but infrastructure. A non-profit for women whose children had been taken and for the children who had been reassigned to provide legal aid, psychological care, and a network to locate and help victims. They called it Mothers of the Taken, the name blunt as a gavel. Julian promised funding, but Ava insisted on governance that included survivors and independent oversight. She demanded it be not another varnished charity, but a practical organ that paid for DNA tests, paid for travel to hearings, and trained lawyers to find the paperwork that often existed but had been buried. It took months to be more than a name. They hired staff who had done this type of work and who understood how to navigate privacy and trauma. They built a board that included women who had been through what Ava had endured, lawyers who knew the tactics of offshore accounts, and advocates who could protect kids. Julian made sure the non-profit had firewalls against capture by any institution that wanted control. Ava insisted that it be survivor-led. The point was not to make a monument, but to make a path. Healing for Ava did not come in a single rush. It came in small moments that collected like coins. She learned to use a kitchen that she had never used before. She put Sophia to bed with a story she wrote herself. She taught the child how to whistle and laughed at the way Sophia's tongue would poke out of her mouth as she tried to make a sound. They brought home one rescued child for a weekend, and Ava met the child's birth mother in a park bench, meeting arranged by Margaret and the non-profit. They cried and spoke because two women had found themselves in the same heart-rending space, and the word mama had been their shared geography. Not all the cases ended the way Ava's had. Some files led to dead ends, some records had been incinerated, some witnesses frightened into silence. The system could not pull every child out of every closet, and the moral of that truth weighed on Ava like an anvil. She learned to grieve the losses while fighting for the gains. Logan Tarrant eventually faced trial. He attempted to plead for a reduced sentence with the promise of testimony. In the courtroom, he tried to explain away language as logistics. He described himself as a conduit, a man who never looked inside the boxes he helped move. The jury did not accept the defense of detached technicality. When certain men on the stand tried to claim ignorance, Ava listened to them with a particular sorrow that matched the dignity of the work she had committed to. Melanie proved harder to break. He had layered himself behind corporate protections and a carefully cultivated public face. When he was finally arrested, after months of investigation and after a judge signed a warrant based on amassed evidence, he did not go quietly. He denounced the proceedings as a political show, as if political theatre could erase the ledger with its ink and the children who had been found sleeping under names that were not theirs. The criminal trials moved like tectonics, slow, sometimes imperceptible, until the plates shifted and a momentous decision announced itself. Sentences were handed down in some cases. Knellies of appeals and motions ensured the legal battles would continue for years, but the center had moved. The public now demanded accountability in ways that tariffs and lawyers could not fully mollify. Clara's murder was investigated. Cooper and Deanna traced the origin of certain phone calls and the pattern of a vehicle. Melanie's network had fingers in places that protected them, but not everywhere. Small men made mistakes. Messages were left on unencrypted phones. One of Melanie's lieutenants turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence and for protection. The man wore his cooperation like a new name. He said in his testimony that Clara had been a liability that needed silencing. The admission, when played in court, did not bring Clara back, but it gave her family truths they deserved. Eleanor's role was complicated. She testified that she had been threatened and financially pressured, and that she had lived for years with the guilt of being a small cog in a vast mechanism. The prosecutors carved her complicity into proportion. The court allowed her cooperation to stand as a mitigating factor. She did not walk free without consequence, but she did not disappear into maximum sentences. Her testimony, though, helped put faces to transactions and let the law creep further into the places the ledger had named. As the trials played out and the public spectacle cooled into legal process, Ava found other battles. Her organization took on cases no one had wanted. She built a long list of names and places and made sure each child who had been found had a professional to help them understand who they were. The work of mending identity began in small rooms with therapists and attorneys. The non-profit paid for DNA tests for mothers in poor countries who had been told their children had died. In 1,000 small ways it turned grief into action. One autumn evening, months after the judge's ruling, Ava sat with Sophia at a public meeting where they were discussing funding for their program. Sophia, now a little older and prone to bursts of serious observation, sat at Ava's feet and drew. With a blunt crayon, she drew a series of boxes and a big lopsided square that looked like a house. She handed the crayon to Ava, who traced a small figure inside the square. Sophia looked up and said, with a gravity that made everyone in the room hush, "Mama." It was a private sound with public consequence. The room understood it as a thing more than a word, a witness to reclamation. Julian, who had changed in ways less visible than headlines might have suggested, kept his distance from the day-to-day of the non-profit. He funded training programs and paid for safe houses, but he also kept his commitments to make sure control was not consolidated back into the very kinds of institutions that had profited. He visited the office, sat at the back of a room listening to women speak, and learned to be quieter. He and Ava had negotiated a new life together that was not about headlines, but about accountability. In public, he remained a figure difficult to pin down. In private, he was a man who was willing to trade influence for repair. Years later, when the prosecutions had exhausted many of their leads and the larger network had been exposed, the world had changed in small ways. Regulations tightened around fertility clinics. International tracking of such transactions improved. Charities began to fund searches and legal teams. The ledger did not erase itself. Legacy remained a stubborn thing. But the business model that allowed children to be traded for image and legacy had been disrupted. Ava did not return to the restaurant where Marco had thrown her out. She did not need to, but she did go back to the neighborhood once, to a small cafe with lemon cake, and sat at a sunlit table while Sophia ate her dessert and called for more sprinkles. The world there was ordinary in ways she had learned to love. She watched mothers with strollers and men who read newspapers with a kind of comfortable fury. The world had not become safe, but it had become more accountable. On a quiet morning, Ava took Sophia's hand and walked along a street that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Sophia drew a house on a scrap of paper, an imperfect structure that looked less like an architectural plan and more like a memory. She colored it in with joy and looked up at Ava. "Mama," Sophia said, the syllable no longer an accusation but a steady anchor. Ava watched her child and felt a kind of long return. The ledger still existed in certain safety deposit boxes. The men who had profited were still making appeals, and there were still mothers in rooms she could not reach. But the sound of "Mama" was now a chorus. Women who had been silenced found their voices. Shelters were stronger. Laws had changed in modest, practical ways. They named a modest house home, not for branding but because it was a deliberate reclaiming. It was not the Hargrove mansion with its curated rooms. It was a smaller place with a garden that needed weeding and a porch swing that creaked in honest ways. They painted one wall a color that Sophia said made the room look like a puddle of summer. They kept the ledger of gifts and grants. The non-profit filed reports and refused to accept donations that came with names attached to legacies of secrecy. The last public hearing that sealed a series of indictments was not the end of the story. It was a punctuation. Men were sentenced for transactional crimes. Some received years behind bars. Others faced corporate dissolution and fines. The law could not recover everything, nor could it reinstate every stolen name, but it could make theft visible and criminal. At night, Ava sometimes woke to the echo of rain on the roof and the soft voice of a child in dreams saying, "Mama." She would lie awake and think of Clara and her flash drive, of ledger entries and safe deposit boxes, of men like Tarrant and Melanie who had treated people as merchandise. She thought of the women who had come to her and told their stories, women with scarred hearts who nonetheless learned to trust again. She would go into Sophia's room and watch the child breathe. There were nights when the child's dream-mouthed syllables seemed to stitch a seam across time, making whole the place that had once been torn. Ava would press her forehead to the child's knuckles and whisper things that were not legal but were necessary. "You are mine. I know you. I will be here." The world had not been kinder to everyone. Some cases remained unresolved. Some children had been taken where the documents had been burned. Some men moved their money and kept their lives. Ava and Julian knew that. That knowledge kept them steady, in the way a stern parent can steady a child who wants to run into danger. They kept fighting in the way that meant they did practical things. They funded teams to comb archives, they helped pass legislation that made certain falsifications felonies, and they trained social workers to spot the signs of bought parentage. They taught lawyers to look for ledger lines, the way detectives look for footprints in mud. The non-profit became a hub where small things were transformed into policy, and where the word "mama" was given literal teeth. What Ava had learned above all was about the stubbornness of names. One syllable, small, human, had fractured worlds. It had forced men in suits to face documents they had once considered ceremonial. It had compelled law to engage with the moral. It had returned a woman to a name the system once stole. In the final scene they ever intended for the public, Ishva, who had once stood in the fluorescent light of a restaurant and been dismissed, walked into a small hall where volunteers had gathered. She did not speak about indictments or about the celebrity that had been thrust upon her. She spoke about practicalities, how to apply for DNA testing, how to keep records safe, how to tell a story in a way that officials could not ignore. At the back of the room, Sophia sat on the floor with a crayon and a notebook. She drew a lopsided house and a woman with two arms outstretched. She added a small figure in the window and wrote, in a child's uneven script, "Mama." Ava noticed without fanfare. She walked over, sat, and drew her own square beside it. She placed the small figure into the window and wrote below it, also in an unsteady, tender hand, "Here." They lived in a world where many things would remain unfinished. Battles would continue, but in a small house with a garden, with a non-profit office that knew how to file subpoenas and a rhythm of hearings that would keep some men accountable, Ava had reclaimed a life. From time to time, Julian would watch Sophia play and think of how a singular moment in a restaurant had opened a lid he had not known he could lift. He placed his hand over Ava's, and they both watched the child draw and erase and draw again. The child had made a world with a crayon. It was not perfect, it was beloved. When reporters still wanted to call, Ava would sometimes answer. She would speak plainly about accountability and law, about how money could bend rules, and how ordinary people could push back when they had the courage and the allies. She would always end by saying something small. "Listen to the children. They know things we have tried to hide." Sophia grew with the steady attention of a woman who'd been called by a child's small voice, and who had spent years answering. She learned to whistle and to say "mama" with all the shapes of the word, a call, a comfort, a legal claim. She learned that her name could be both a warm sound and a juridical fact. She carried both. And when the ledger of the past was finally shelved among court documents and public records, when men had to live with the consequences they had paid to avoid, Ava would sometimes sit at the window and watch the rain draw lines down the glass. In those lines, she could see the loud syllable that had started everything, the small hand that had reached for her at a restaurant, the sound that had rewritten a life. "Mama," Sophia would say during the rain, and Ava would answer because the word had never been granted a free pass from truth. It had been reclaimed, restored, and lived. If this story touched you, follow the work Mothers of the Taken supports and consider sharing it with someone who believes in accountability for the vulnerable.